Thomas Hayne Cutbush. Yes, quite unusual names, aren't there, in this research we've done for Jack the Ripper. He does look like an interesting character, doesn't he?
It's like Gollum.
A little bit, very thin face, doesn't he? Very thin.
My precious.
Jamie.
He does.
But anyway, yes, Thomas Cutbush. So I suppose he was a bit of history of him. He was born in 1866 in Kensington, a few miles, I think about 3 miles down the road from Whitechapel in London. And he was 22 years old at the time of the murders in 1888. He was from a reputable middle class family. His childhood was a bit conflicted though. Father left when he was quite young, left his mother to bring him up on his own. His mother never married again after the original split from his father. And Kate and her unmarried sister Clara brought Thomas up. They were quite religious, the pair of them, and it was sort of suggested that they might have suffered from some kind of neurological disorder as well, apparently. Which certainly would explain him being a potential suspect, I suppose, in the sense of having some interesting influences from female characters when he was growing up, perhaps. He also showed some serious behavioural problems in the jobs that he'd had. Fired from pretty much all of the jobs that he had. Yeah, his second job where he actually pushed an employer down a set of stairs. And then he just sort of became, I suppose, extremely idle and sort of presented some sort of extravagant behaviour. He isolated himself reading sort of medical books quite often in the day, and then wandered the streets of Whitechapel at night. And he was often seen hopping fences, apparently, because he was very nimble and agile, and he was seen jumping through people's gardens, which is obviously again very suspicious activities in the middle of the night. You're generally up to no good, probably robbing or worse. I think it came to light, his accusation as a particular suspect was an article in a newspaper in 1894. Sorry, the Sun accused him through a series actually of articles. The public accusations didn't give rise to the prosecution of any criminal charges against him, and police hierarchies even defended him, dismissing Cutbush as nothing more than able to commit, a simpler crime than murder. They just didn't think he had it in him, apparently.
He was put in a lunatic asylum, wasn't he, just after the last murder? Wasn't it? It's like March '89 or something like that. He was committed.
March 1889, yeah.
And then there was lots of. He was violent as well at times, but he was a proper sort of like bipolar sort of character. That he would be incredibly violent at one moment and meek and weak.
Jekyll and Hyde.
Just saying, he used to like smearing himself in fecal matter and things like this as he got more and more unwell as time went on.
Yeah, he was even doing that in the institution, wasn't he? Smearing himself in food and excrement and things like that, I believe, up until he passed.
Which is one of the things that was potentially done to the second victim, I believe, was their intestines was smeared in fecal matter. I can understand why he was considered a suspect, and then I can also see that there's that chronology of that mental unraveling. And we'll talk about when we talk about whether these are the only victims or whether there's more victims. Generally, serial killers, there is a progression. They don't start, with the more advanced murders like the Mary Jane Kelly. They have to. There is a build up to that. They start.
There's an escalation in violence, isn't there? Usually,
Yeah.
He looks a proper gentleman of the era, doesn't he? He looks quite affluent.
Yeah, born in 1850 in Scotland, moved to Canada when he was 4. He come out of medical college with honours. The first murder that he did was of a chambermaid, which was found in his office. He was charged with. He wasn't charged with the murder, and he got away with it. 1880 was the second murder that he committed, because he was a serial killer as well. again, he got away with it. He was charged for that murder, but he got away with it. And then 1881, a Mr. Stott, who he killed, and he made a mistake. I'm not sure what the mistake was, but he was caught for that murder, and he was put in prison for 9 years. Until 1891. So a lot of people suggest that he can't have been Jack the Ripper because he was in prison in Illinois, in America. But a lot of people say that he had a double who was working with him, for him, who looked like him, took his name, even sort of took his place in prison, that they say. So that the real Thomas Green was able to go out and go back to England and do these killings. Excuse me. He was hanged in 1892, and apparently his last words were, "I am the Ripper." And it's also said that he could have possibly have bribed the prison guards to release him from prison, but to actually say that he's still there in prison. So yes, so there's a lot of things going on with this guy. But his murder style was to poison people. So again, a lot of like ripperologists say, why would he change his killing style from something that's quite sort of peaceful, really, in a sense, to, you know, a slaughterhouse.
Most serial killers do stick to an MO, don't they? But it isn't inconceivable. Some do change.
Oh yeah,
If they're clever enough and they're aware of the police being aware of their MO, they may change their MO. But but I think that there's a level of awareness that I don't know if all serial killers probably even have that level of intelligence and awareness. Some do, definitely.
That's why the son of Sam got away with it for as long as he did, because he kept changing his MO. So he didn't
Well,
realise
the
they
woman,
were with a serial killer who got killed about 12.
the first woman that he killed, from what I've looked into, was his mistress, who was pregnant. Killed her like chloroform.
Oh, no, he nearly killed her. Apparently, that's why I left that one out. That's what I saw. But he.
She was. He murdered Kate Gardner, his mistress, in 1879, and she was found pregnant and dead from chloroform. One of his specialities, because he was studying medicine. He would also send numerous anonymous letters to the papers accusing other people of being the poisoner, because he was known as the Lambeth Poisoner. But he would frequent local prostitutes and poison them. You know, try to start chatting to them like in these bars and stuff before he allegedly to take them where they wanted to do the business. And he would put strychnine in the drinks. So that is how he would kill them with strychnine. So his first victim, or victim number one, if you like, killed with chloroform, and the 4 that he was hung for were killed with strychnine.
Lovely guy.
Yeah. And some say that
Again, it is completely conceivable that his MO would change as his mental health deteriorated, as he unravelled. His rage might have become more. He might have had a need to become more violent as he unravelled.
Another miscreant of the Victorian era, Montague John Druitt. Okay, so there's a picture of our Monty. I feel like I can call him that. He was born in 1857 as the son of a prominent local surgeon and an officer of the law. And he was a bright child, apparently, and he obtained a scholarship to attend Winchester College at the age of 13. And in school, he participated on the debate team and was an opening bowler for the school's cricket team. After leaving school in 1880, he joined the Inner Temple, one of the qualifying bodies to become a lawyer in England at the time, which was located in London. And to pay for his legal training, he took a job as an assistant schoolmaster at George Valentine's boarding school in 1885. During this time, he also played cricket with the prominent clubs across England, and he was dismissed from his position at the school in 1888 for an unknown reason. And newspapers at the time said it was because Druitt had gotten into serious trouble. And a month later, his body was found in the River Thames, presumably dead from suicide. Okay. Now, why is he considered one of the Jack the Ripper suspects? Well, it's saying shortly before his death in 1888, the Ripper claimed his final victim, Mary Jane Kelly, as we discussed earlier. Shortly after, rumours began to spread that the Ripper had drowned in the Thames. 3 years later, in 1891, a member of Parliament from West Dorchester began saying that the Ripper was the son of a surgeon who had committed suicide on the night of the last murder. So he was the son of a surgeon. Montague John Druitt was the son of a surgeon, and he committed suicide in the Thames. So the rumours were tying him into being linked with the murder. Journalists and law enforcement officers at the time also corroborated this story of the Ripper dying in the Thames after his final murder. This description led contemporary law enforcement and later investigators to suspect Druitt, who had committed suicide in the manner described by these rumours directly following the last murder. Assistant Chief Constable Sir Melville McNaughton of the London Metropolitan Police even named Druitt as a suspect in the Whitechapel murders in a private memorandum that was written in 1894. Does it stand against him? Not really. Because even though people at the time seemed to genuinely suspect Montague John Druitt, there's little more than vague circumstantial evidence really linking him to any of the murders. Beyond that, Druitt wasn't really trained in any medical techniques, and something many people suspect that the true Ripper was. And furthermore, his suicide can be reasonably explained by a note he left to his brother, which said, "Since Friday, I felt that I was going to be like Mother, and the best thing for me was to die." And his mother suffered from depression and insanity and died in an asylum in 1890. She had attempted suicide in the past, as had his grandmother and many members of his family. Also, Druitt had solid alibis from the cricket games he played, showing him far away from London at the time of many of the other murders. So realistically, the only thing tying him to the murders were his place and time of death, as well as the hearsay of some law enforcement officers, and none of them were directly involved in the Whitechapel murder case.
Didn't his family believe he was the Ripper, though?
Yeah, allegedly some of his family members thought he was, yeah.
But he wasn't in London for at least two of the killings, apparently.
Well, that's probably part of the reason why he committed suicide, wasn't it? His family thought he was the Ripper.
Wouldn't help, would it?
Wouldn't help a lot, would it? You would,
Thanks, Mum.
If you've got a solid alibi corroborated by a team of players from a sports team, I think you're good. Like you can't say that they're. Well, you never know. People can be bought. If you can buy people. So that's why it's always if all these people that are quite look quite affluent, and then they've come from good middle to upper class backgrounds, they can probably buy people's silence.
Yeah, but in the same breath, those kind of people can't also afford the infamy of having that kind of slander as well, I suppose. But you raise a good point there, Damien.
The diary of Jack the Ripper. So
yes,
this caused massive. This is world headlines when this book appeared. So it was 1992. Michael Barrett, a scrap metal man from Liverpool, came out and said, I've got this. I found this book, this diary. It doesn't name James Maybrick directly, but it is signed off at the end of the diary, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Lots of study into the document and what he says in the diary does point to this chap, this James Maybrick there. He says that there was his wife had an affair with a Whitechapel gentleman in 1888. James Maybrick had followed his wife, saw the deed, and that triggered the series of murders. He was then actually murdered by his wife in 1889. She poisoned him with arsenic. Gotta wonder, maybe did she know? Did she know something? There are some problems with the story, though, that you have to kind of believe the diary is genuine to connect James Maybrick to the murders. He does make a couple of mistakes in the diary. One of the things he talks about is, for example, like the Mary Jane Kelly murder, that the breasts were removed and then hung on the wall. That was something that was reported in newspapers, but as we discussed earlier, isn't actually true. And there was a couple of other discrepancies in some of the factual information, because I mean the diary is, if you've ever read it, is thorough. It's there's lots of detail in there. There's lots of detail of the murders. It's very gruesome. Yeah, lots of it is correct, but there are a few little discrepancies that are incorrect. But like I said, to believe this story, to believe that James Maybrick is the murderer, you only have to believe that the diary is genuine. So obviously lots of studies been done on the paper, the ink, and the evidence is a bit here and there. Some people say that yes, it is really the paper and everything is authentic to the period. So therefore, maybe this is the genuine article. Others have said maybe not so much. Unfortunately, Michael Barrett at one point did say that he had actually admitted he'd forged the document. He then backtracked and said he hadn't. His wife, who was at that point his ex-wife, also says that he didn't forge it, and actually the diary had been in the family's possession since at least World War II. But to be honest, one of the best ways of forging a document is actually to get a book. To forge this diary, you get a blank diary from the period, and you forge a document. They're saying if ever you're going to forge an old painting, you get a canvas from the period, you scrape it off, you forge a painting on the old canvas, because then when they do the study to say, okay, they carbon date or whatever they do, is this from the period? It is. So that might be one reason why the diary might have genuinely been from this period. Doesn't necessarily mean the diary is genuinely the Jack the Ripper diary, though. Then there was this watch that was found, and it was found roughly at the same time. That was really suspicious. It had the victim's initials, a gold pocket watch, that flips open. It had the initials of the victims, the 5 victims, scratched on the inside of it, and James Maybrick's name. So to me, that screams coincidence and screams somebody tried to make a book. And it is, to be fair, to say that the Michael Barrett did make a decent coin off this. He sold the story to the newspapers. At the time, it was £50,000, which was a lot of money back then. And obviously, the James Maybrick, the Diary of Jack the Ripper, was a bestseller for several years. I personally think this is probably a forgery. I was convinced by it at the time. I actually owned a copy. I've read it several times. But the inconsistencies with some of the details is a concern. You could say that maybe if it was genuine, he was in a frenzy while he was killing Mary Jane Kelly, and then in that case, that's possibly why some of the details don't match. There's also no particular evidence that he was actually in the East End of London at the time, or in the Whitechapel area, even though his business did have connections to the area. I think he was in Cotton or something, if my memory serves. So his businesses did have connections into the area.
And the pocket watch has been verified to be of the time period, as you say, and the engraving is proven to be at least a few decades old. But the scrawling, the engraving isn't solid evidence of anything whatsoever. So,
and apparently other studies have said it's far more recent. So that's what I'm saying about the evidence is very much here and there. Somebody will do a study and go, yes, it's of the era. Then somebody else will come out and go, maybe not. Actually, you get a timepiece from the late 1880s, and then you get some engraving on it, which can be seen as being a few decades old when it's looked at in the 1990s. Suggests to me that a few decades old is the 50s, 60s, 70s. So a good 70 years. Yeah, 70 years out of time, if you excuse the pun.
German fella, raised in the UK. I think one of the main reasons for Sickert being the suspect is Patricia Cornwall, with her research that she did. And she's supposed to have matched some mitochondrial. I can't even say it.
Mitochondrial.
Yes, DNA.
So I was literally like a moment behind you there, Dave, with mitochondrial.
Yeah, that one.
More made up words.
Yeah.
Lies, all of it.
So found some of that DNA on some of the Ripper letters, which matched the DNA on some of the letters that Sickert had written throughout his life. And also many of his paintings also exhibited ladies' naked bodies in the postures of Jack the Ripper cases. And he also had quite a fascination about the Ripper murders.
How reliable is the DNA evidence, though? Because obviously that's a modern
exactly
thing. So But that, if it's genuine, that would actually be proper forensic evidence pointing towards somebody that at least, I mean, it's only said they'd only sent letters. Like I say, we know at least 700 letters were sent. So maybe he was somebody who was obsessed with it and sent a hoax letter, potentially. But that's actual, real, tangible, empirical evidence against somebody that we don't have any of the victims. We don't know. It's just a suspect, sorry.
Mr. Sickert. From what I can ascertain, a big chunk of it as well is, like you say, Cornwell believes that the secret to his true identity is Jack the Ripper's because of his work. It's because of the paintings, as you say, because you're saying like it mirrors the murder scenes a little too closely to a coincidence. I'm not so sure about that. His name had also been mentioned in connection with the Ripper case before as well. Through somebody who claimed to be his illegitimate son, Joseph Sickert, claiming that he confessed guilt on his deathbed. So he admitted to his illegitimate son that he was the Ripper on his deathbed. And decades after the killings, Cornwell embarked on a costly crusade and wrote in the Telegraph, she believed so much in his guilt, she spent $7 million buying paintings and his writing desks in hopes of finding clues. Clues weren't there. But Cornwell did find some outrage from the art community when she tore up one of his canvases. So, famous for being a prat, pretty much.
So many are.
There was
So many famous prats. So, yeah.
Well, the one thing I'd say is that his surname. I mean, it's his surname. He did it. No, I mean, no. But his surname's a weird surname. Having the surname Sickert and being. Yeah, I don't know. Being a suspect as a murderer. I don't know. It just, yeah. But anyway, the thing I was going to say was there was, wasn't it in that Cornwell book? She said there was a psychological motivation, wasn't there, for him doing it, where he had some kind of disfigured penis or, something like that.
Is it on these type of shows we use the terminology misshaped phallus? If you don't mind, please, Damien.
What time are we on? Oh no,
we're beyond the watershed, so you can say weird weenie if you really want to.
I'll go with weird weenie then.
The pictures that we're putting up of these suspects, it makes it look like it's a rogues gallery anyway, isn't it? By default, really. But this gentleman here, Aaron Kosminski. Yeah, he's got to have done. It's got to be him.
Case closed.
Unbelievable.
We've just wasted an hour and 40 minutes. You could have just put that picture up.
But DNA analysis provides evidence that Jack the Ripper's true identity was Aaron Kosminski. Because at the time of the killings, Mr. Kosminski was a 23-year-old barber living in Hastings in London. He was also a prime police suspect in the killers during the initial investigation, which is also true. His name did come up. Aberline and McNaughton believed he had some kind of doing with the case, and he was heavily involved in it. I think, even lightly involved in it, you're the perpetrator. And also by forensic investigators throughout history also sort of think that this might have been the guy. Because allegedly it's supposed to have solved the case, and that's been claimed many times before, as we've said. Because there's been new genetic analysis of Jack the Ripper's DNA data was performed by Dr. Jari Luulainen and then Dr. David Miller, that was scientists at the University of Leeds, and it was published in the Journal of Forensic Science in March 2019. The science sequenced the mitochondrial DNA from blood and semen found on the shawl of Catherine Eddowes and compared it to the genetic sequence to DNA samples taken from living descendants of Catherine Eddowes, who's the victim, and Aaron Kosminski, who is still allegedly a prime suspect, or the prime suspect. And the DNA matched that of Mr. Kosminski's descendants, providing very strong evidence that the killer was Mr. Kosminski. Went into a lunatic institution and the killing stopped. Coinky-dinky, coincidence? Coincidence seems to be playing quite a big part in a lot of murders throughout history, and seems to be playing a big part in this one. Is it coincidence? I don't know. So the DNA guys, what do you think about that?
DNA evidence is, when done properly and when done accurately with a viable source, DNA evidence can be fingerprint evidence is about 1 in 600 accurate, so they can identify you up to 1 in 600 people. So really, if you ever get done for fingerprint evidence, check it, because it's not as unique as people would believe. But DNA evidence is about 1 in 8 billion. So if you have a DNA accurate link, there's a chance of 1 in 8 billion that they can be. Even though DNA is pretty much unique, our ability to identify the differences, that's sort of the chances you get.
1 in 8 billion. So now there's 8 billion people, you've potentially got someone else with similar enough DNA that you'd match.
Yeah, which is only that many people on the planet today, so we're pretty much safe. So when DNA evidence is done properly, it's really, really convincing and you're stuffed. The problem is when you've got DNA evidence that is from a source that is corrupt or 120 years old or anything else, then it becomes significantly less accurate. And then you're talking about probabilities rather than, real empirical evidence.
This has got to bring us on to the absolute 100% was I would do, though, this, hasn't it? I mean, how much of a high-profile suspect do you want than this particular next dude? Which means that Jamie, a.k.a. the Bomb J-Meister, you get to do our Mr. Willy, Prince Albert Victor, a.k.a. Willie. Take it away, sir.
Lots of movies have been based on this now, haven't they? The theory that, a lot of people have argued that Prince Albert Victor was actually the murderer, but we could pretty much say that he wasn't, because he wasn't actually even in the country at one point during the murders. But if we go into the From Hell movie with the great Johnny Depp, who just played Johnny Depp in that movie, actually. But who was the woman in it? The one that who played Mary Jane Kelly? Heather Graham. Heather Graham. Yeah. Anyway, I love Heather Graham. So he was the Duke of Clarence in Avondale. He was known as, like you said, Willie, or sometimes Eddie. He was the Queen Victoria's grandson, and he would have been second in line to the throne. He was not in London for a couple of the murders, but in the 80s, he was he died actually in 1892 from influenza, from the Spanish flu pandemic, or a flu pandemic of 89 to 92. Sorry, not the Spanish flu. He was diagnosed as having something wrong with him in the mid-1880s that he was on medication for, possibly gonorrhea, but there's also some rumours that he potentially had syphilis. The idea being that he potentially frequented prostitutes and caught syphilis on one of these encounters. There are other... This guy had an interesting life, basically. There is the Cleveland Street scandal, which was it's actually a gay brothel that was broken up by police, and they arrested sort of like the main pimp guy. And this main pimp was starting to sell names to try and get himself immunity and get himself out of trouble. And one of the names that he brought up was that Prince Albert Victor was one of the customers. These things were never actually released in newspapers in the UK because, there's until quite recently there were still laws and there was sort of like an agreement with newspapers in the UK that they wouldn't release names about the royal family, but it was insinuated in lots of newspaper reports. So he was known potentially to visit prostitutes. So now there's a couple of variations of the story. Now, either he got syphilis from one of these women, and he basically went on a revenge spree or wanted revenge taken out on these women. The other idea is that he potentially got one of these women pregnant. If he got one of them pregnant, this child, because he wasn't married at the time, would technically be in line to the throne. This became known, and Queen Victoria became aware of it. The rumour being then that Queen Victoria asked somebody, there's lots of suspects on who that might have been, to deal with it. I don't believe Queen Victoria have ever said, kill the horse, but that's my Queen Victoria impression. But if she'd have just said, deal with it, that would have then been taken. Well, we know from Princess Diana case that when Lizzie said deal with it, somebody might have took that the wrong way and dealt with it. So that is potentially why these murders were committed that way. Then we get into the Masons and all sorts of different theories on what then transpired. One of the theories being that the murders were done in such a brutal way to sort of cover them up, because a lot of these prostitutes knew each other. And we actually know that Mary Jane Kelly did know at least 2 of the other victims, or at least they knew of each other. So we know from the Hell movie that Heather Graham did have the baby and she escaped. In reality, it may have been that she did have a baby and didn't, and that there was that this heir to the throne might have been taken out, and that these murders were perpetrated in this way to sort of cover up the fact that they knew each other. And I think it was almost like a double bluff type of idea, I think, even though it doesn't really stand up to logic, because there was so much murder and so much violence in the East End at this time. If these 5 women had just been disappeared, nobody would have known, and we would never have spoken about it, because they disappeared on a daily basis.
Weren't the murder statistics very low prior to these 5 murders occurring? Because I heard there had only been six murders in the last year prior to this spate of 5, or something to that effect.
Quite possibly, but prostitutes were beaten and abused on a daily basis,
and raped and not paid for their services. Yeah, okay.
And just disappeared. The Michael Caine Jack the Ripper movie sort of focused on this idea, and that was that the doctor that was sort of given the task of dealing with this actually had syphilis himself, and basically went on a revenge killing. I've always loved that theory, and he he went on the revenge killings because he saw part of himself in this thing, that he was on syphilis, he was mentally unwell, he was having a psychotic break himself. When Queen Victoria and the people that were sort of involved in this realised how much out of hand it was getting, they sorted him out, and that's why the killing stopped so suddenly.
I was going to say, MO wise, it gives a modus operandi, doesn't it, for Jack the Ripper? Apart from what we were saying before about perhaps negative maternal influences in your childhood, if you caught syphilis from a prostitute, it really gives you that modus operandi to then have that hatred for prostitutes, to then go and be able to cause that level of physical mutilation to them for the mutilation that they've caused to you.
Well, I'm thinking, in this instance, Prince Albert Willie should be called Prince Albert Dirty Willie. I think that would be quite apt. So Eddie wasn't even in London on the days of the murders, which Jamie said, but that hasn't stopped any of the theories, and it hasn't stopped him from being forever associated with the shadow of Jack the Ripper.
Just curiously, what evidence is there that he wasn't in London at that time? Is it just that he was said to be at a meeting by some close friends somewhere else in another country? Because, like our Prime Minister says he's not at the Bilderberg Group every year, but he is.
Or even if the police did interview certain people, they're not going to make it public knowledge. And they wouldn't have interviewed anybody because it didn't come out until 1962 or whatever did it. So many years after it had been done away with. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Damien. There'd have been a shroud of cover around him. I'll give you an alibi. I'll give you. They've been climbing over him climbing over.
How much do you want? I need an alibi.
Yeah,
I'm a prince.
Well, look at Prince. Is it Edward? What's the prince now that was at bloody Pizza Express when he was accused of?
You mean Andrew?
Prince Andrew.
The Epstein scandal.
The Epstein scandal. Yeah, exactly. The police cannot speak to him. He basically shut it down. There's always set up a thing of lies, and that's today with the royal family today.
Yes,
the royal family was all powerful back then. People would kill to protect their just to avoid a scandal. Yeah. And these were people that were up to no good all the bloody time. They were always up to no good, but it never got into the British newspaper. There will be cases, if we go back through, that the Jack the Ripper will have perpetrated where he was trying to learn his trade, where he was trying to figure out potentially what he wouldn't have just possibly known he wanted to commit murder. There would have been an element of that hatred and rage, and that would have required some escalation, some learning. There probably would have been rapes, there probably would have been assaults, There would have been attacks on other women that we don't necessarily know about, and it's impossible to connect it to Jack the Ripper because the MO would have been probably completely different. We know
True.
from Yorkshire Ripper the same thing. There were several cases of attacks building up to it, building up to his first murder.
I don't know how good the police were back in 1880s about linking serial killer cases either. You've got to think that. I don't know how
They
good.
didn't have serial killers, though, mate, did they? They didn't understand.
They didn't exist. No.
That's what I mean. So this was kind of like the first time they'd come across probably a series of murders that they were like linking all to the same person, where the only real motive for the murder was pure hatred and
the manner of the deaths was the thing that tied them in the eyes of the police. That was it, because they didn't want to count Liz Stride because she had only had a throat cut, you know. So it was just the manner of the deaths which tied them to. They didn't have profiling, and as Jamie said, the term serial killer hadn't been coined. Not even spree murderers and things like that, really.
It was the 60s, really, until we sort of had any sort of psychological link to serial killers and trying to, like you say, creating any sort of profile. And even then, it was scorned. It was, I mean, police and that's not police work. You're trying to get into the head of the serial killer. No, we need to go and knock heads. We need to go and bang on doors. That's police work. You know, trying to understand the murderer was frowned upon by lots of police. You look at the I mentioned the Son of Sam case earlier, but the Zodiac killer, that was one of the first murders that they started actually trying to profile the I think, and they were able to identify sort of these build-up cases from that profile. Bad example because they never caught him either. But
no, a good example then in a way.
Yeah,
good example in a way. Do we have any more pre before we go on to some after?
Well, I don't know about the after cases, so I'm all ears.
Okay, cool. Well, we do. We have another case immediately before Polly Nichols. And again, we've got some photos. Well, a photo of this particular lady, Martha Tabram. This was the 7th of August, 1888. So about 3 weeks, just over 3 weeks before the first acknowledged Jack the Ripper victim. Like I say, 7th of August, 1888. On Tuesday, the 7th of August, 1888, following the bank holiday Monday, she was murdered at about 2:30 a.m. and her body was found at George Yard Buildings in Whitechapel. She'd been stabbed 39 times with a sharp blade. And on the basis of statements from her fellow prostitute and PC Thomas Barrett, who was patrolling nearby, Inspector Reed put soldiers at the Tower of London and Wellington Barracks on identification parade, but without positive results. And police did not connect her murder with the murder of Emma Smith, who was mentioned earlier, but they did connect her death with later murders. Most experts apparently, again, there's that E word, do not connect Tabram's murder with the other attributed to the Ripper because she was repeatedly stabbed, whereas later victims typically suffered slash wounds and abdominal mutilations. However, a connection can't be ruled out. At the time, the possibility of two crimes being related was merely speculation. Sort of like talked about that earlier. They didn't have the profile and so on and so forth. The mindset of serial killers or spree killers. And in later years, a lot of people would rule out Emma Smith as a victim of Jack the Ripper. But on the other hand, Martha Tabram would go on to be considered the first potential victim of the Whitechapel murderer, as he was known at first for many years. And that school of thought would carry on almost unopposed until the mid-20th century with the discovery of a document penned by Melville McNaughton in 1894. And in the document, he would confidently suggest that Jack the Ripper only claimed 5 true victims, and the first was being Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly Nichols, on the night of the 31st of August, 1888. So... she again. This sounds just so churlish, almost to say it in a way. But so I'll choose my words more carefully. This one, she wasn't only stabbed, but I mean, she was stabbed rather than mutilated, which sets her apart in the eyes of the investigation as being a non Jack the Ripper victim, because she wasn't mutilated; she was just stabbed. However, Jamie, the escalation.
Yeah.
You know, is it because she wasn't a Jack the Ripper victim, or is it because she was the first stage of an escalation and he hadn't yet reached that stage of maniacal intent to want to rip the victims yet? You know,
they talk about psychopathic maturity, and it's almost like they're growing, and like I said, it's that thing about learning their trade almost. That a lot of serial killers.
You've just made me think of a new Netflix series. Serial killer, learning the trade.
Learning the trade, yeah. Hey, Series 9 of Dexter is coming. Talking about serial killers learning their trade. I can't wait for that.
What about serial killer, The Apprentice? That would be a good one.
Yeah, The Apprentice, yeah.
It's all right. I only kill bad people. That's kind of the whole premise, isn't it, to Dexter?
Yeah. Genius series and a code. Genius. I love that. You know, every so often the series come like, I wish I'd thought of that. You know, like, because I like to write little stories and things. I wish I'd thought of that. It's so clever. But yeah.
X-Files.
But I do. It does. Yeah. It just makes sense to me though that there would be attacks that went wrong. Again, going to the Yorkshire Ripper. There were 2 or 3 attacks that he got wrong. He got one that he got overly confident and she got away. He did one. He thought she was dead, and he got overly confident and she wasn't dead. And, you know, and he just walked off, and he learned from that, unfortunately. And a lot of these crazy people, they're not stupid. A lot of the time, they're very highly intelligent. They do learn from their mistakes.
Exactly, that's how they get away with not getting caught for years. Some of these, I mean, I'm just trying to think of who's probably the most prolific serial killer that you know what I mean. That they
there's a couple in there, but there's the Russian guy that got a couple hundred, didn't he?
Yeah.
And it depends how you look at it though, because like Dr. I forgot his name.
Harold Shipman.
Shipman got
Harold Shipman.
large numbers.
Yeah, I suppose actually he'd be considered one of the biggest, wouldn't he?
He wasn't actually like physically sticking a knife in there, was he? He was poisoning and
he was poisoning them, which is a very easy way to distance yourself. Like stabbing somebody many times or mutilating them, it's very much personal, close thing. Poison somebody, you can poison their drink and you can leave.
Yeah,
it's very impersonal.
He looked her in the eye when he slit her throat. That is very different to poisoning somebody and just knowing what you've done.
Didn't they try to take what was it when they thought that the last thing that the victim saw was imprinted on her eye? So they tried
photograph of the retinas.
Photograph the retina.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Okay, so there were other victims.
That was a thing.
Is that available somewhere? That photograph of the inverse of a retina? That would be a scary image, wouldn't it?
It was believed that was a thing, wasn't it? But it's not. It's not true. But yeah. Sorry, go on, Dave.
There were also another couple of victims worthy of note. I think, well, obviously any victims worthy of note. And this is Alice Mackenzie, 17th of July, 1889. So well after Mary Jane Kelly. So Alice Mackenzie was possibly a prostitute and was murdered at 12:40 a.m. on Wednesday, the 17th of July, 1889 in Castle Alley, Whitechapel. And like most of the previous murders, her left carotid artery was severed left to right. So left to right.
That's pretty. So that's just someone right-handed generally slashing like that across, isn't it?
And there were wounds on her abdomen. However, her wounds were not as deep as in previous murders, and a shorter blade was used. Commissioner Munro and one of the pathologists examining the body, Bond, believed this to be a Ripper murder. Though another of the pathologists, Phillips and Robert Anderson, disagreed, as did Inspector Aberline. Later writers on the subject have also been divided, and either suggest that Mackenzie was a Ripper victim or that the unknown murderer tried to make it look like a Ripper killing to deflect suspicion from himself. At the inquest, Coroner
Copycat,
Baxter acknowledged both possibilities and concluded there is great similarity between this and other class of cases which have happened in this neighbourhood, and if the same person has not committed this crime, it is clearly an imitation of the other cases.
I think it might be. It's 8 months from the frenzied last attack on the fifth victim, wasn't it, Mary Jane Kelly? So it just seems. I think it would be, if you wanted to murder somebody, a woman in Whitechapel in that time, why wouldn't you set it up as a Ripper murder? It'd be a perfect way to try and get the blame away from you and from anybody that connected to knowing her personally, and push it onto Jack the Ripper, who nobody can prove who he is. It's a
The
great.
thing is as well, anybody else that was quite mentally unwell, I mean, Jack the Ripper by this point was almost a celebrity. You know, it was, well, he was a celebrity, and there was the mystery was already growing. And if somebody was unwell, it would be a copycat. It would be somebody wanting to, you know, almost like emulate their hero.
Comes across like that in the letters as well, a little bit. And so, I am a celebrity, look at me.
Yeah. We'll go back to the point that there was 700 letters sent in by different people saying that they were Jack the Ripper. You know, a lot of these were hoaxes, but a lot of these were actually very sick people that, you know, were almost looking up and wanted to be him.
I think if you study serial killers, though, it doesn't take long for you to realise that a large amount of them are megalomaniacs. They will think they're a star. There's been more than one serial killer throughout history that have been wanted to get caught, to be acknowledged for what they've done and what they thought they've achieved, and not been happy when they've not been acknowledged by either the press or the police or the public because of what they feel they've done or achieved. So when you're dealing with the mind of a murderer, don't expect it to be normal.
It's why there's more than one case where they've tried to inject themselves into the case somehow. It is one of the things they say to do with certain types of serial killers. They actually start trying to look at people who willingly come forward with information. They become an immediate suspect because it's happened repeatedly. And a lot of these times, these killers think they're cleverer than the police. As soon as they get away with it 2 or 3 times, they think they're got a right to do what they're doing, which is even more terrifying. That they think they're doing it. That they think what they're doing is right or righteous, or they think what they're doing, they've got some sort of right to do it. These people are lesser beings, and somehow so their death doesn't matter. So it's almost like when they get caught, it's sort of like, well, why are you trying to punish me for this?
Like the aristocracy cleaning up the streets. Like that's the wealthy cleaning up the criminal-ridden streets. You know, all these prostitutes,
getting rid of the pests. Yeah.
Which has happened. Do you remember? It was before the Olympics, the Rio de Janeiro Olympics, and loads of children went missing off the streets. And it turned out that it was the elements of the police department. They put together kill squads because they didn't want all these homeless people to appear on the telly during the Rio de Janeiro Olympics. And there was some estimates that anything up to 200 children were just literally taken off the street and disposed of. You know, and that was in modern times. Sometimes these people think that they've got a right to do these things. They think they're doing, they're doing the right thing for some reason, and it's it's only you dehumanize somebody. They're not human. They don't deserve to live.
Well, they've done brain scans, haven't they? MRI scans of the chief executive, chief financial officers. You know, people sit on the boards of big companies, and the brain scans come back and show very similar results to the brain patterns they find in psychopaths. You basically need to be a psychopath to be a CEO of a multinational company that makes billions of dollars, because you've just got to care about profit for the shareholders. You have no consequence for any effect on any humans or any empathy for any humans and how it affects any humans in your organization. You sack people. You've got to be that cutthroat. So you have to be a psychopath.
There are serial killers with psychopathic tendencies as well. That they've said afterwards that a lot of their murders was because they don't have that empathy. They don't have that understanding of that it's somebody else's life. So the murders were almost an attempt to understand, particularly when you start getting into mutilations and things, because they're literally sort of like
Like
why is
removing a
this
piece of
different?
lint,
Yeah, that's it.
ending someone's life. It's just like moving a piece of lint from your clothes. It's the same, or taking the cap off a bottle. It means the same thing.
But
Yeah.
for them, it was a way of trying to understand. They knew the. I'm trying to think of the murderer's name. It'll come to me in a minute. But he did lots of interviews after he was caught, and one of the things he kept talking about was that he thought they were hollow because he couldn't understand that this was a different person. So he said so when he was murdering them, he wanted to try to see. He was trying to understand why they were alive, basically, and if I want a way of putting it. So his way of murdering was literally trying to understand something he didn't have the ability to understand. So it was like he felt that hollowness. So but he used to cut open the stomachs. That's one of the things he did because he wanted to look inside.
Why didn't he cut open his own stomach then?
Yeah, well, that's the next thing, isn't it? If only you'd thought of that sooner. Can't think of his name.
And we've got one more potential, which I'll put up on the screen. Francis Cole. Okay, Francis Cole, 13th of February, 1891. So again, a fair bit after Mary Jane Kelly. And the last of the murders that are in the Whitechapel file, bearing in mind that Martha Tabram, Alice Mackenzie, Francis Cole, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, them 8 were contained within the Whitechapel file. So they were all they're all being investigated after, by the police as being a potential thing. So she's the last of the murders that were contained within the Whitechapel file and was committed on, like I said, Friday the 13th, February 1891. She's 25-year-old, so again, younger like Mary Jane Kelly. She was a prostitute, and she was murdered under a railway arch in Swallow Gardens in Whitechapel. Her body was found by PC Ernest Thompson only moments after the attack at 2:15 a.m. She was lying beneath a passageway under a railway arch between Chambers Street and Royal Mint Street. She was still alive, but died before medical help could arrive. Minor wounds on the back of her head suggest that she was thrown violently to the ground before her throat was cut at least twice from left to right and then back again. Otherwise, there were no mutilations to the body, leading some to believe Thompson had disturbed her assailant. Superintendent Arnold and Inspector Reed arrived soon afterwards from the nearby Leman Street Police Station, and Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, who was heavily involved in the Ripper case, and Henry Moore, who had been involved in the previous murder investigations, arrived by 5 a.m. A man named James Sadler, who had earlier been seen with Cole, was arrested by the police and charged with her murder. A high-profile investigation by Swanson and Moore into Sadler's past history and his whereabouts at the time of the previous Whitechapel murders indicates that the police may have suspected him to be the Ripper. However, he was released on the 3rd of March for lack of evidence.
That's surprising for police back then that they released somebody for lack of evidence. Surely they just made it up.
That is a very good point. Yeah. Any time between the Victorian era and 2021, making things up. So there we go. That we've gone through the victims, we've gone through some of the suspects, and we've discussed some of the possibilities. All in all, the Jack the Ripper, any closer to even remotely knowing who he is? No.
Not really.
We're not, are we?
We've got a bunch of really good suspects, but there is no way of knowing. I mean, you said there we got DNA evidence. We've got DNA evidence that links 2 different people to it. It's just like
so much evidence wasted or disposed of as well. So
from a police that didn't care and were inequipped.